I think that an achievable goal is helping people better understand the complexity and the nuance of other people's views. Once you understand where a person is coming from and all the richness of their thinking, you almost can't help but like them more. And you don't have to agree with them.
Whether you lean left or right, you've probably heard that the upcoming midterms are the most consequential in American history. But no matter who wins, we'll still be living with a deep fracture down the middle of our country. Because we're so polarized, we have a system that fails to solve problems that affect everyone, and an ineffective democracy is a weak one. But we're not going to stop disagreeing, so how can we make disagreement work for us? This is Beyond Polarization, a limited series for Making Peace Visible. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. Across 7 episodes, we're going to look deeply at the corrosive problem of polarization in the United States and the different ways it damages us as individuals and as a nation. We'll feature people who are looking to bridge divides in 6 sectors of society: journalism, new media, education, government, tech, and civil society. We'll be focusing on solutions that people have found to reduce the divisiveness and distrust that makes getting anything done so hard. And with this new series, I'm proud to say Making Peace Visible is now a member of the Democracy Group, an excellent network of podcasts dedicated to creating a more informed, civically engaged electorate. Polarization is a macro-level problem, but it also shows up in our everyday encounters. You might sit on a school board with parents who you clash with over vaccination policies. Maybe your boss treats you unfairly based on your opinions or your identity. Or there's a family member you cut ties with because they voted for someone you despise. The good news is there are research-backed ways to change people's minds about those they perceive as their enemies. That's why we're starting the series with the help of a research psychologist and expert on disagreement. Julia Minson is a behavioral scientist and an expert on the psychology of conflict. She began studying polarization long before it became a household word. Julia is a professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and author of How to Disagree Better, published in March 2026. She's also the founder of Disagreeing Better, a behavioral science consulting firm that offers speaking and training to help people manage conflict effectively. Julia, welcome to Making Peace Visible, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
I want to start with a question that might speak to the skeptics listening right now. A lot of Americans feel exhausted by polarization, but they're also convinced that the other side is uniquely dangerous, irrational, unreachable. For Americans on both the left and right, often their starting point is not curiosity about the other side, but assumptions about who they are and what they believe. What would you say to someone who might be skeptical that this conversation is even worth having?
Well, we're kind of stuck living in the same country, so we have to have lots of unpleasant conversations. If 2 people both think that they're right and the other person is dead wrong, one of them, is making some unfounded assumptions. And in fact, there's a lot of research evidence that says that people both on the left and on the right are pretty inaccurate about the other side. I like to live my life kind of according to the evidence that's out there in the world. I would hate to avoid conversations because I've made incorrect assumptions and I'm sort of not willing to challenge them or question them.
Well, we often talk about polarization as if it were a national condition, but it can mean many different things.
Yeah.
Hostility towards the other side, loss of basic trust, seeing facts through partisan lens, that's a big one, even accepting political violence. Help us understand polarization with a bit more nuance.
Sure. So polarization in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, right? One of the ideas that's embedded in our democracy is that people on the left and on the right have different ideas, different policy proposals, see different priorities as having greater urgency. And that is kind of the soul of how democracies are supposed to function. So just the fact that people disagree with each other is not the end of the world. What I think people worry about is what political scientists call affective polarization. feelings towards the other side, negative feelings, that could be sort of a distrust, could be a dislike, and that has many negative consequences, right? So people not wanting to engage in conversation, people not wanting to sort of spend time with or, marry somebody from the other political party. So the concern isn't that we disagree. The concern is that disagreement has turned into kind of a toxic mindset towards the other side.
Right. Well, you've written that our country is in a disagreement crisis. As a psychologist, how do you assess the state of polarization in the United States right now? I know you're not a clinician, but if you were, how would you diagnose it?
So, the job of assessing polarization is in the domain of political scientists. And the way they do it is they run ongoing surveys that look at how people evaluate folks in their own party and folks in the opposing party. And you can sort of imagine that you would like people on your side better than people on the other side, right? We generally like people who agree with us. But that gap has been steadily widening at a pretty alarming rate. And so you just see this kind of, V shape as like things sort of spread out over the years and now a couple decades. And that's a real problem.
Well, if you were to make a generalization, how significant is the gap between partisan perception and reality?
Massive.
Massive. Okay.
And
that's clear.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different folks who study this area. As a result of that, they have identified many different types of gaps and misperceptions. So one really important gap that people have studied actually since the 80s is what's called false polarization. This is the extent to which you think people on the other side are more extreme in their views than they really are. So it's polarization, but it's false because what you perceive is actually greater than what exists in reality. And that's looking at extremity. There's another type of incorrect assumption that has been published recently, which is what I think you think about me. I dislike you because you're from the other party, and it's reasonable to assume that you dislike me, right? But my assumption about how much you dislike me is roughly twice how much you really dislike me.
Right.
Right. So I think you're more extreme, and I think you like me less than, the little amount you like me to start with.
Right.
And then I have a group of co-authors where we're working on yet another flavor of misperception, which is, if you think about people, they usually have complicated opinions made up of, lots of issues. You think something about immigration, and you think something else about healthcare, and you think something else about the environment, right? There's all of these issues that are kind of like your typical hot button issues.
Sure.
Now, what we find is that people assume that folks on the other side have kind of like very monolithic views where all the issues clustered together. By contrast, people on my side, well, I'm nuanced and complicated, right? So I have sort of a variety of perspectives, whereas you are just sort of like drinking the party Kool-Aid and you believe whatever it is they tell you. We can go on, but there's at least 3 different ways that we misperceive the other side.
Well, I asked for nuance, and there it goes.
There it goes. Yes, there's lots to this.
There is, yeah. Why do we often experience opposing views as a threat? Why does hearing from the other side feel less simply like hearing another point of view and more like an attack?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know that opposing views actually are threatening. I've written about this, and I often disagree with my colleagues about it. When you think about something that's threatening, it's something that puts you in danger, something that might make you anxious or insecure. And that just doesn't fit with the experience that people have when they listen to opposing views, right? When I listen to somebody I disagree with, it makes me angry. It makes me frustrated. I don't feel insecure about my views or sort of, people talk about their identity being threatened. When somebody disagrees with me, I might think that they're stupid. I certainly don't think that there's anything wrong with me. And in fact, one of my former students, Charlie Dorison, and I have written a paper about this. And what we find is that people think that other people feel threatened, but they themselves primarily feel sort of anger and disgust and frustration about, why does another person just get it? And that, makes a big difference to how we approach these conversations, right? Because if I'm saying to you, oh, you shouldn't feel threatened by my good ideas, like that sounds so condescending.
Exactly.
Right?
I get it. Yeah, I mean, it's a perception problem. A central idea in your work is receptiveness.
Yes.
Not necessarily agreeing with somebody or even finding common ground right away, but showing that you're willing to seriously engage in what they think and why. You've written that what makes the most difference is making receptiveness visible. I love that statement because it's so close to the mission of our whole project, which is to make peace visible. And receptiveness is a necessary precursor to peace. How do you identify receptiveness? What makes it visible?
So, when I first started my research career, we were really looking at receptiveness as a mindset. Are you the sort of person that thinks hard about opposing perspectives and gives them the same amount of time and mental energy as you give arguments on your own side? And what we realized after, quite a few years of studying this construct and measuring it in different ways is that that's not enough to impact conflict because people just can't tell what's happening in your head, which seems like so obvious. And yet, most of the time, when we give people advice on how to handle conflict better, we tell them how to change their thinking, right? We tell them to be more curious. We tell them to be more open-minded. We tell them to be more empathetic. And all of those things are great, but your counterpart can't read your mind. And so when we talk about making receptiveness visible, we talk about what is very concrete language that communicates receptiveness. It's the language so that other people can actually recognize the work you're doing in your head.
So using words like?
So we developed this idea using natural language processing. So in other words, we take thousands of transcripts and we literally pick out the words and phrases that make somebody seem like they're being receptive. So you start out with sort of like a whole mess of words. And then now the way we've kind of simplified it in order to train people is an acronym, which is HEAR, as in I hear you. So every letter in HEAR stands for something different. The H stands for hedging your claims. So it's phrases like maybe, sometimes, perhaps, right? The idea is that you are showing...
You're making room.
You're making room, right? You're showing
space.
The other person that you're allowing for possibilities and exceptions. Mm-hmm. And so they don't need to fight with you about it because you already showed them that you kind of get it, right? The E stands for emphasizing agreement. So like, I'm not going to agree with you. I'm not going to change my mind, but I might emphasize the fact that we have the same concerns or we agree on part of the question. So it's phrases like, I also want to, or I too am interested in, or I agree with, part of what you're saying.
Yeah, like we both agree that XYZ is wrong, but we disagree about how to get there.
That's right.
Or how
how
to change it.
That's right. Or, I agree that the state of polarization in the United States is a real challenge, right? The A is acknowledgement. So acknowledgement, I think, is what a lot of people, make very sort of central in this work. And I agree that it's very important. It's taking a few seconds to restate the other person's point of view, right? So again, you're showing with your words that you really heard them. And then the R stands for reframing to the positive. So dropping contradictory and negative words like no, can't, won't, don't, terrible, hate, kill, and replacing them with more positively valenced words like great, appreciate, wonderful. But a lot of people ask me this question of like, if you use receptiveness and then you say but to express your own point of view, isn't that bad? And one of the benefits of, using kind of a bottom-up measurement approach is that we don't make any assumptions about which words are good and which words are bad, right? We just simply let the data tell us. And but doesn't seem to make any difference, good or bad. We think it's because in order to say but, you first have to restate the other person's assumption or the other person's claim, right? It has to be like, you are saying that, but... right? Or I agree that, but. And so you have to show some listening before you say but,
Right.
which gives you some credit.
Right. Yeah, you get points.
You get points. Yeah, yeah.
You were part of a mega study with more than 90 other academics looking at interventions to strengthen democratic attitudes among Americans. Can you give a bit of background of that study? What was the premise behind it? What kinds of interventions did you look for?
Yeah, so this was a project led out of Stanford by a young scholar named Jan Vogtel. The idea is that most of the time when we do research, somebody comes up with an idea for decreasing polarization, and you compare it to a control condition, right? So like, I might tell you, Jamil, anytime you see a person you disagree with, give them a hug. Right? That's going to be our treatment. And then like in the control condition, don't give them a hug. And then we'll see if the hugging condition performs better than the not hugging condition. But then I don't know if that hugging condition would perform better than, if I said, Jamil, every time you see a person you disagree with, ask them the basis of their beliefs. Right? Like maybe
show some curiosity.
Right? Mm-hmm. And so I could show, well, hugging works relative to control and curiosity works relative to control. But how does hugging and curiosity work relative to each other? Because if we're going to spend money to teach people things, teach millions of people things, then let's spend money on the right stuff. And so the idea of a mega study is that you take a whole bunch of interventions from a bunch of different people and you compare them to a control condition and to each other so you can kind of rank order them. So that was the idea. And then because they were doing it online, right, you can imagine that there's logistical limitations, right? So each of these interventions was something you could do, you could ask a single person to do online. And it had to, I believe, fit in under 8 minutes.
Well, tell us about some of the most successful interventions.
So, everything in this study was done online because it was such a large-scale effort. And what it really offers us is a glimpse of what works in a small dose to see what we could then do if we, gave people a really big dose.
Right. Scaled it up.
Exactly. Right. I actually ended up submitting 2 different interventions, and one of them ended up placing first in the effective polarization reduction category. And what it was actually an old Heineken commercial. So Heineken gets credit, but they really created something very brilliant where they shot this 4-minute long commercial where you had people with wildly different political attitudes work together on a project. They get this big box and they get tools and they have to follow instructions. And there's sort of this mystery element to it because they don't know what they're building. And then it turns out that what they're building is a bar, like a home bar that, you could sit down and there's 2 bar stools. And then, of course, they sit down at this bar and they open, cooler and there's 2 cold beers in there. But right before they crack into the beers, a big screen comes down and they find out that this person they have just been working with for, last several hours building this thing has wildly different attitudes from them on politics. And they kind of hear, all these things that the other person would say about somebody who believes what they believe, right? And so you see this very awkward moment. And then there's sort of this question of like, well, do you want to walk away or do you want to have a beer with this person and talk it out, right? And so, of course, it's a commercial, right? It's staged. So everybody in the commercial sits down and has a beer, but it's incredibly heartwarming. And I was really surprised when it was the top performing intervention. But then I thought about it and I realized that in the commercial, they sort of brought together like every great idea of social psychology and mushed it all together into 4 minutes, right? So these people are working together towards a common goal. They're learning intimate details about each other's lives as they're, hammering together this bar for hours and hours. There's humor, there's suspense. In the end, they succeed. There's a heartwarming finale.
And they drink a Heineken.
Right? And so watching this, it's incredibly humanizing. It's very sweet. And, what it really made me think about is that if we're going to do effective intervention, it shouldn't be just sort of like researchers in the lab doing these, very nice, very elegant experiments. We really need to partner with industry, and we need to partner with creatives to have much more impactful ways of addressing this problem. I think it was a really great example of, a research industry collaboration.
Well, in a funny sort of way, we're living in a split screen moment where we have the World Cup, which is for Americans, a massive lesson in geography, for one thing. But we see all this wonderful spirit on one hand and calling people names and diminishing others on the other hand, at the same time. And the contrast is quite stark.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about sports, so I have a colleague at the Kennedy School, a guy named Todd Rogers, who runs a big research project looking at how sports can be a force for depolarization, because it is something that reaches into, every home across parties, across, demographics, ages, incomes, and it really bonds people. It's one of the few institutions that people are still truly committed to.
Peace-building organizations like Search for Common Ground have used soccer in that way, and they've created soap operas around soccer teams. And the way the relationships play out is a lesson.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, no, it is great. Some interventions involve correcting misinformation. One of our guests in this series, a mediator and YouTuber named Larry Rosen, argues that providing facts doesn't often change people's minds. And it's something that we've heard again and again over the years. Based on the research, are there ways to correct misinformation that people are more receptive to?
Well, you just mentioned this idea of storytelling through sport. And there's actually sort of there's a rich tradition of using storytelling to correct misinformation, either at scale, right, when people produce radio shows or soap operas that, sort of get the facts out there through a story, or one-on-one. It's very tempting to sort of say, like, I believe what I believe because I read a white paper that says blah, 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 right? Or I read a New York Times article that says, here's this study. Or you can say, look, here is what my family went through as first-generation immigrants.
Right.
And for that reason, this issue is really important to me, and this is what I believe. And that is so much more humanizing than citing the facts.
It's hard enough to influence ordinary Americans, but what about the people who work in politics? Polarizing rhetoric can be a ticket to getting reelected or staying in office. On the other hand, when political leaders adopt depolarizing behaviors and language, they have the potential to influence larger groups of people.
I think with any human behavior, right, we have to be realistic about a person's goals and what are they actually trying to accomplish. Politicians have different incentives than rank and file folks. And I think all of us are also, we often misperceive our incentives. We think that something will get us reelected, or we think something will get a particular piece of legislation passed, and our intuitions aren't always correct. A great example is Governor Spencer Cox of Utah, who has launched this campaign. It's called Disagree Better, which is sort of no relation to my company, Disagreeing Better. They just happen to be.
Or the book.
Or the book. We all believe in disagreement and we all want to do it better. The Disagree Better campaign is Governor Cox. It started out with him and his opponent for the governorship of Utah, just standing up in front of a camera and saying, look, we disagree, and we disagree about a lot, but we believe in democracy and we will accept the results of the election. And, what's interesting about that is that they came across as warm and respectful of each other, but they were clear that they disagree. They didn't say we're going to compromise and we're going to get along and, Utah will be sort of a purple state. And I think that's very powerful because people don't want their politicians to run towards the center necessarily, but they want them to be civil and they want them to have good relationships with folks on the other side. And so that video went viral. And since then, there have been analogous videos made by state and local leaders from across the United States. And that campaign has now been studied at Stanford. And what they find is, in fact, that those leaders who participate in those campaigns are seen very positively by their voters. So there isn't like a penalty for standing next to the other guy and showing civility and thoughtfulness. It seems to actually
It's actually a plus.
It's a plus. Yeah, it works.
The COVID-19 pandemic sadly increased polarization in the United States. Debates over masking, lockdowns, vaccines. It was an exceptional time in that the pandemic affected everyone. One trend related to polarization is increasing distrust in institutions and expertise. But experts aren't immune from polarization. This was demonstrated by a study you helped lead that looked at attitudes towards COVID-19 treatments among lay people and doctors. Can you describe that study and what you learned from it?
Yeah. So, early in the pandemic, there was this idea that you could take ivermectin to prevent or to treat COVID. And it was an idea that was ultimately proven to be ineffective, but there was some coverage of it on the news. And I believe President Trump briefly supported it, which of course then gave it kind of extra legs. And so we sent a survey out to a large panel of medical doctors and a large panel of lay people. And we asked them sort of a hypothetical question about a person who has COVID and how likely would they be to recommend ivermectin to this person. And what we found, what we thought was quite startling, was that your political affiliation was a strong predictor of whether you would prescribe ivermectin, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words,
even if you were a doctor?
Even if you were a doctor.
That's amazing.
Which was crazy.
That's amazing.
Yeah, really, really wild. And so we really we were surprised by the relationship between polarization and the willingness to prescribe. And we were surprised by the lack of difference we saw between lay people and doctors, which was, really, really quite startling.
And what accounts for that? Is it ideology or?
Obviously it's hard to say. I think, if I were to guess, what I would say is that nobody has time to read all the research that's out there. Right? One of the things we asked people in the study is where they get their news from and where they get their scientific information from. And you'd be surprised by how few doctors said, well, I go to the medical journals and I, read the research. What many people said is, I read the summary on TikTok. Right? And so you get a very shortened version of the available medical information, and you don't get a kind of accurate representation of the whole literature. You get what the algorithm wants to show you, right? Which, of course, is biased by your partisanship. So I think it's
filtered.
It's filtered, and it's filtered by, where you live, what other things you click on. And so, of course, more conservative physicians are more likely to get information that sort of supports this idea. The more liberal physicians are more likely to get information that contradicts this idea. And nobody has time to look into it because it's a pandemic. Right. So in that time of kind of confusion and limited information, I think we're much more kind of subject to cues from our side because nobody has time to really look into it deeply.
That's one of the big things, the lack of time and the lack of attention. Let's say you could go back in time, Julia, and advise government leaders on COVID messaging. Is there anything you would do differently?
What's interesting is that we have huge industries, marketing, advertising, right, that are very closely tied to the social sciences. If you are Nike and you're releasing a pair of sneakers, you're going to spend a tremendous amount of money on how do you release the information about the sneakers so it hits consumers just so. And
makes them want to buy it.
Makes them want to buy it, right? So we know a lot about how to message to people. Now marketing sneakers is different than marketing vaccines, But I do think there was a lot of missed opportunity, in part because it was sort of this emergency situation.
Right.
In part
life and
because,
death.
right. And, I don't think the government sort of thinks, well, let's go ask the researchers how we should have messaged. But we know a lot of things about how they should have messaged. And there was an opportunity to leverage both the research community and I think the business community to get greater consumer buy-in, around the safety measures, around the treatments. And so this is, I think, another place.
Harm.
Yes, I think this is another place where more collaboration and asking for help and asking for feedback would have been far more effective than what we saw.
Curiosity is a very good thing. I think the relationship between polarization and democracy, or the fragility of our democracy, to be more specific, is not as commonly addressed in public discourse as polarization itself. But the left and right have blamed the other side for potentially destroying American democracy. As an expert on conflict, how do you view this relationship between polarization and democratic life in the U.S.?
I think this idea that we blame the other side for what we both see is deeply, deeply human. And I think that's something that's really worth thinking about more and appreciating more. A really important idea that has motivated my research is something we call naive realism. So it's people naively believing that their perceptions and their attitudes sort of reflect some objective reality that's out there. And that makes it very, very hard for us to see the other side and their point, right? Because it's sort of like, how could you? And I think in this case, both sides say, well, January 6th was a huge attack on democracy, and ruling by executive order is a huge attack on democracy. Another side will say, well, yeah, but your presidents also ruled by executive order. If you look at all the misdeeds of the previous Democratic administrations, that's an attack on democracy too. Both sides focus on what they want to see.
They're reading the same facts differently.
They're reading, right. Well, they're looking at a very complicated array of facts, and they're paying attention to one set. And they absolutely sort of like fail to recognize what draws the attention and the ire of the other side and why the other side is so angry.
Well, democracy requires people to lose sometimes, to accept election outcomes, accept limits on power, and continue working with people they may strongly oppose to solve problems our country faces. From your perspective as someone who studies conflict, what makes losing feel intolerable in a polarized environment?
I think it's this idea that the other side isn't just sort of different or even less good than my side, but that they're truly terrible and evil and destructive. People don't think that, well, if I lost this election, now I have to wait 4 years to enact my agenda and my reforms. They think I lost this election, now the world is going to end, right? Because we have such extremely negative views, the stakes feel much higher, which then, of course, leads to some perhaps rash actions that then just gets us into a spiral.
You not only do research on polarization, but you also have a practice to help people learn to disagree in more effective ways. And of course, you've written a book about it. So you're involved in promoting change in significant ways. For 30 years, I worked for USAID and the World Bank, promoting environmental and social reform in developing countries. And one of the things I learned was that people don't like to change. They prefer tomorrow be much more like today, even if the conditions they're living with are bad. I found that sometimes you have to show people the cost of not changing in order to motivate them to accept the change and adopt the reform. Do you think that explaining the cost of polarization is an effective way to motivate people to change? I mean, does that fit into your practice? Does it come up in your research?
I think this idea that people don't like to change, people are doing the things they're doing because it's working for them right now. And so trying to shift them from that is a very real challenge that we think about it a lot. I like to look for situations where there's a big incentive to change, or you can make people change whether they like to or not. So 2 examples. I think that getting people to disagree more effectively in healthcare contexts is easier because, you have people very, very motivated to make something work to help a patient.
Again, it's a life and death.
That's right. They are willing to talk a little differently. You know what I mean? If you've gone through years of medical school and residency and fellowship, you haven't slept in 15 years. If I teach you a few more words to make your patient relationships go more smoothly, those guys are motivated. So I think looking for contexts where people really want to do the work because they have a mission that's really important to them. And the other one I often think about is schools. We teach our kids all kinds of things they don't want to learn because we know it's good for them. Like, it is very rare that a kid wants to learn algebra, but, we make them do it anyway because it's good for you in the long run.
Right.
So to me, teaching young people how to disagree better is something we should be doing.
Absolutely.
Just because it needs to be done.
What does the research suggest is actually repairable? In other words, are we trying to make people agree more or dislike each other less or trust each other more or recommit to democratic norms? How would practitioners know which goal they're working towards?
I think that an achievable goal and one that is in line with our democratic principles that actually value disagreement is helping people better understand the complexity and the nuance of other people's views. Once you understand where a person is coming from and all the richness of their thinking, you almost can't help but like them more. And you don't have to agree with them. You can hold on to your beliefs. They can hold on to their beliefs. But if we got to a place where we understood the other side, I think we would be in a much better place than we're in today.
I'll ask one more question. A lot of people are skeptical of depolarization work because they hear it as a call for civility in situations where they believe something morally serious is at stake. What would you say to those people? How do you distinguish between receptiveness from what some people feel like is moral surrender?
Yeah, no, that's why my book is called How to Disagree Better. It's not called How to Agree Better. We're really focused on teaching people how to continue disagreeing, and I think when it comes to really vitally important questions that have a moral component, well, usually when you have a person in your life that you disagree with, you need to continue having that relationship with them, right? Either they're a friend or they're a family member or they're somebody that you are, living in a country with or crafting policy with or running a business with. You could just sort of walk out and slam the door, but chances are that there are goals that you need their cooperation to accomplish, right? And so if you can't have a conversation, you're not going to accomplish those goals. So if you're seeking influence, then you have to be more receptive, right? Receptiveness is basically a tool for influence because otherwise you're just out there on your own, having stopped talking to people.
Right. Right. Well, this is a good place to end. And I'm so excited that this is the beginning of our series on polarization. There's a lot more to learn, but I'm delighted that you're here and grateful for the work you're doing.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
This episode was produced by Faith McClure and Andrea Maraskin. We had audio engineering help from Adam Dusenberry. Our next episode comes out on August 4th. We'll be talking to two leaders in journalism focused on presenting the news in a depolarizing way and highlighting stories of solutions. In the meantime, you can follow the Beyond Polarization series on social media, where we have video excerpts from this and upcoming episodes. We're on Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn at Making Peace Visible. You can also find videos and excerpts on our new Making Peace Visible Substack. To sign up for our newsletter and get an email when new episodes come out, go to makingpeacevisible.org/contact. And please consider supporting our work with a tax-deductible donation. Go to makingpeacevisible.org/donate. And Making Peace Visible is now a proud member of the Democracy Group. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.